Welcome to another Dr. Sadler's Honest Reviews. This is a series in which I review mostly recent works in practical philosophy in a very broad sense, which would include philosophy proper, a lot of ethics things, but also extending over into studies about leadership or psychology or self-help and everything in between. Now, the book that I'm reviewing today is actually very solidly within practical philosophy in a technical and academic sense. It is John Sellars' The Art of Living, the Stoics on the Nature and Function of Philosophy, the second edition of the work. And it's not really all that recent, as a matter of fact. So this edition published in 2009. The first edition was published in 2003. And you might say, well, usually you're reviewing recent books. Why are you going back in time to reviewing this one? Well, I'll put it to you this way. It's an excellent work that I'm going to be highly recommending as we go on further in the video, but there's also a little bit of backstory here. So one of my viewers emailed me and said, would you be willing to review this book? I know that you typically do, books from just a few years ago, but I really like it, and I think that you would get something out of it. Now, I actually had a first edition of it, the hardcover as well, and I said, well, if you send me the most recent edition, sure, I'll review it. And so I'm going to thank right away Dominic Escorpeso for having me sent this copy. It's been a while, so he's been waiting for me to get around to reviewing it, and I'm very happy to be able to do that at this time. I'm also going to make a disclosure up front as well. John Sellars is both a friend and a colleague of mine. We're both members of the Modern Stoicism organization, and we've interacted a number of times as well. So that doesn't actually influence my review of the work, because this is such a great work, it would stand on its own. So I'll tell you why that's the case. As usual, I'm going to first talk about some basics, the style, the summary of the work, structure of the work. Then I'll go into some of the key ideas, and there's many key ideas in this. We'll talk about some of the good points, and there's many to this work. And then we'll talk about anything that I found problematic. There's not an awful lot of that with this particular text, but there are a few things that I'll bring up. So, no further ado, let's jump into the review. Style, structure, summary, the big three S's. Which of these should we approach first? Let's start with summarizing what this work is. So, the title gives some of it away. The Stoics on the Nature and Function of Philosophy. That's the subtitle. It's a little bit more technical. The Art of Living. Okay, that's a big, broad conception. And I think that actually these two play off well against each other for giving you an idea about what the book is doing, summarizing the progression of the book. So it is beginning with talking about the art of living, which is, in fact, one of the very many different definitions of philosophy that are provided out there. And it is one that some Stoics, in fact, used. But it's not a uniquely Stoic idea. And that's part of what John Sellars is trying to bring across. And the Stoics are not the first to come up with this notion of philosophy as being involved in one's life, as being practical, as being an art about how to make decisions, how to live, how to prioritize, how to do all these sorts of things that are so central to not just individual instances, but an entire life and the process of living. So that is part of what the book is about, is exploring not just what the Stoics have to say about it, but also the prior philosophers. And, these are going to be people who come to influence the Stoics, but also those who criticize or are skeptical towards the Stoic and other perspectives on this as well. So, if you haven't got a big background in ancient philosophy, this book will actually help you out in that in some respects. Now, structure, let's talk about that. I mean, you can always know what the structure of a book is by looking at the table of contents. And it's divided into two main parts. Part one is, there's these Greek terms, bios and techne, right? So bios means life, a life that one lives, right? And techne is, you often translate it as art or craft. It's the word we get technical from and technique from. The second part, two more Greek terms. Part two, logos and eschasis, right? So logos is the word that we get logic from, and all of those ologies that you might have studied, like biology is the logos about bios, the logos about life. And then eschasis, this is the word that we get ascetic from, not aesthetic, but ascetic. And it has to do with discipline, with conditioning oneself, with exercises, with practices, all of those sorts of things. So what are the connections between these two things in each of the sections? And, the first part has 4 chapters. The second part has 3 chapters. Then there's a conclusion. One of the things that you'll find is that each chapter itself has a sort of conclusion called a summary, where actually not every single one. Chapter 5 doesn't have that now that I'm looking at it, but every other chapter does have a summary. And they're all, bringing things to kind of a useful close. You're going to find a bit of repetition in the book, but it's needed repetition. And it begins, understandably enough, with an introduction. Actually, prior to that, there's the preface to the second edition, where John says, "I'm delighted Duckworth is publishing this paperback edition, first published in hardback in 2003. I'm especially pleased it will take its place along the many respected volumes already published in the series. My hope is it will now reach a much wider audience than it has thus far." And I think that has actually been realized. And he talks a little bit in the preface about, some of the rethinking that he has done and why, what was the purpose behind writing this book. And we're going to come back to that when we go to the key ideas of the book. There's a number of abbreviations because it's kind of an academic work. And then there's the introduction where he brings us into the topic, tells us what he's going to be doing in the various chapters, and then gets into them. Now, I'll run through the chapters in just a moment, but I do want to point out something else that's really quite nice about this book. After the conclusion, there are additional notes, right? This is, and this is, not a very long book, by the way. This book is about, so including all of the index, about 228 pages long. So it's not particularly long. It is rather dense. But there's these additional notes. So there's an additional note on Socrates that talks about the so-called Socratic problem. How much of this stuff that we're getting in Plato is really Socrates and how much is Plato and all that. And there's some discussion about that. Then there's a note on Stoicism. Who counts as a Stoic, right? There's another note on the text of Epictetus that tells us about the discourses or dissertationes. And then there's another note on the text of Marcus Aurelius, the Meditations. Then I think this is very helpful for a non-Greek reader. There's a glossary of Greek words and phrases beginning with anthropos and going on for 4 pages all the way down to psyche, right? So this is a nice feature of the work. There's a guide to ancient philosophers and authors. This is probably also quite helpful for somebody who doesn't have a big background in ancient thought. Then there's a bibliography that I think is probably more for the academic reader. I don't imagine too many other people consulting it. And then there's an index of places, where are the texts, and a general index as well. So this is a book that is actually written to accommodate scholarship, academic readers, but also ordinary people who are literate and interested in these issues in ancient philosophy. The last thing I need to talk about is the style, because we'll talk about the particular points of the chapters in the next section. So I think John is a great writer. This is, as far as I'm concerned, very readable. It is written in academic prose, but it's not the kind of prose that is overly jargon-laden. Whenever there's a discussion going on about some technical point, there'll be some explanation about what the words mean. And, there's a lot of great sort of background encapsulated in this. Examples are being used. So this is a book, I think, that would be fairly easy for a non-specialist to get a lot out of, and it's almost like an initiation into the language and the ways of approaching these things that scholarship on ancient philosophy brings. So I think this could actually function in many respects as a book that draws the reader in and educates them along the way. So that's the 3 S's. Let's talk now about some of the main points of the work. I suppose that if you were going to restrict me to saying just one thing about the work, telling you what the main point, the main argument, the main thrust of the work is, it would be that in ancient philosophy, philosophy was conceived of as something that was a way of life, not just a matter of different theoretical conceptions or arguments or things like that, but something that was supposed to transform our way of living. And it was an art of living. It was not just, a bunch of ideas that then you immediately apply. There's something practical to philosophy itself. And that runs throughout the entirety of this work. So that is a main point. Another key idea that we see running throughout this is that ancient philosophy was not just a matter of treatises and arguments and, ideas that are strung together, not a matter just of logoi, right? But it was also a matter of storytelling about what it was that ancient philosophers had done and what they said in particular instances, how they provided human beings with examples, and as well as discourses, as well as an interest in theoretical and practical truth. On the other side as well, John Sellars is really great about bringing this home. It's not philosophy if it is turned into just a set of practices, what we would nowadays call life hacks, right? Ancient philosophy is very, very much about practices. They can be called spiritual exercises, they can be called philosophical practices, they can be called all sorts of things. And it's also about little, things that people call quotes or reminders or affirmations, maxims. But it isn't just about that. There's a cohesive framework. To be a Stoic means to adopt a certain way of life. To be a cynic means to adopt another certain way of life. Same thing with even being a skeptic in ancient times. And so that's a very key point. There's a systematic structure to doing philosophy that we don't want to allow to be lost. Another thing that comes out, I said I was going to talk about the preface. So another thing that really comes out here that I think is very important is that Sellars says that this is not just a matter for ancient philosophy or modern reinterpretations of ancient philosophy. This is something that we see throughout the history of philosophy up to our own time. And he brings up, a number of different people. He mentions Nietzsche. He mentions Hegel. He talks about this debate between Richard Sorabji and Bernard Williams, both of whom had been trained in the analytic tradition. There are a lot of different people who are working with something like philosophy as a way of life. And he also talks about this in the very end, in the conclusion, that it's not just a matter of ancient or even medieval philosophy. So he brings up, here's a great example. Throughout the Middle Ages, philosophers such as Peter Abelard and John of Salisbury drew on the readily available Latin works of Cicero and Seneca, not only for philosophical ideas, but also for an understanding of the nature and function of philosophy as such. In the Renaissance, the same thing happened. We can see this in Petrarch's On the Remedies of Both Kinds of Fortune. In the 16th century, the same occurred as part of the explicit attempt to create a neo-Stoicism by Justus Lipsius. More recently, as I noted in the introduction, Nietzsche developed his own version of the conception of philosophy, drawing on his philological education in ancient philosophy. Under the influence of Nietzsche, Foucault can also be seen to turn to this technical conception of philosophy, and we could come up with so many other examples as well, including the work of John Sellars himself, right, who has enriched and contributed to this vast reservoir of philosophy as a way of life. So broader metaphilosophical conceptions are at play here. To ask what kind of art is philosophy is asking about the nature of philosophy, and as he points out, the function, the purpose, the end product of philosophy as well. And so this brings us to one of the key questions that is being grappled with in the text. What kind of art, what kind of techne is philosophy? And Sellars surveys a whole number of ideas that are coming out of, like, for example, Plato's Gorgias and, intra-Stoic debates, right? And then Epictetus later on, and all sorts of other people along the way. So I'm going to read a little bit more from this just to give you a sense of the discussions that are going on in this. So in the Apology, Socrates holds up craftspeople in general as the only example he can find of individuals possessing secure knowledge. The question is, well, what kind of techne do they have? In the Gorgias, the arts that are explicitly used in relation to the idea of an art taking care of one's soul are gymnastics, gymnastike, and medicine, iatrike. These are both presented as being concerned with the health of the body, with preserving or restoring a good state to them. They can be seen as examples of stochastic arts, right? So this is a distinction that gets made in ancient times. This stochastic notion that people have been, talking about recently in relation to other things like stochastic terrorism. It's an idea that comes from ancient philosophy. It's, you have a sort of general thing that you can do, and, if you have the techne, it will generally lead to success, but, it's complicated factors, so perhaps it won't do that. Is the art of living, that is philosophy, that kind of art? Or is it a transformative art? Or is it an art that produces a guaranteed product, And so there's this entire review of different kinds of techne, right? There's acquisitive art. There's a performative art. There are theoretical or contemplative arts. There are productive arts. And this gets reconsidered later on when we're turning explicitly to the Stoics in the chapter on that. And there's a discussion about, how similar is philosophy to medicine? Is it a stochastic art like that? And we come to be able to distinguish between the art itself and having the art, having the principles, and producing the effects that are connected to the function of that art. So these are some really great distinctions that are worth understanding and thinking through. We should talk about the structure of the chapters and what each chapter is concerned with. So the very first one, philosophy and biography, right? Now, why begin a book talking about biography? Well, because Sellars wants to stress to us that in the way philosophy was being understood in the ancient world, life and the discussion of a life mattered. So he begins with this interesting subchapter, the philosopher's beard. Is it important to have a beard as a philosopher? Why? Why is a beard viewed as a sign of philosophizing? And he talks about, the difference between Cicero on this point and Epictetus on this point, what shaving could mean. Then he talks about erga, deeds, and logoi, discourses, the philosopher's bios, meaning the life of the philosopher. And then he talks about biography, right? So what are the biographies that we have? Well, we have Plutarch, who writes these lives, Xenophon's Memorabilia, which is, concerned in significant part with Socrates. But there's, Xenophon writes other things as well. Diogenes Laertes, Life of Diogenes the Cynic. There's a very interesting life, one of the many lives that figure into Diogenes Laertes. Porphyry's Life of Plotinus. And each of these is a different kind of philosophical biography. And we see that they're all, playing a role in that. Then the next chapter doesn't jump right into Stoicism. It's called The Socratic Origins of the Art of Living. And it looks at Socrates and what we can get out of Xenophon and what we can get out of, some of Plato's texts. And it does some comparative work to Aristotle, who is, 2 generations removed from Socrates, and who also had some interesting ideas. The discussion here includes, the analysis of Techne and the Gorgias. It's a nice short dialogue, a lot of cool stuff going on there. If you haven't read it, it's worth reading. And here's where we get that discussion of the different kinds of Techne. So that's already in chapter 2. And then it brings in the role of ascesis. What is ascesis? Well, discipline is one way that we translate it. It's doing things, doing exercises, habituating yourself. And then we get an interesting discussion of Aristotle's interpretation of Socrates. And then we have a conclusion. Chapter 3 gets us to what the title of the book makes us think it's going to be about, the Stoic conception of the art of living. And it turns out that, this is something that is developmental. The Stoics are not all on exactly the same page from the very beginning. And there's a lot of, each generation thinking matters through, both in relation to their opponents or rival schools, but also in relation to the Socratic ideals that are coming to them and their own fellow Stoics. So there's a discussion in here about, the phrase, the art of living, which we find in Epictetus, but we find analogs of it in other Stoics. The ideal of the sage, this is a really great discussion of, who the sage is supposed to be. Maybe it's Socrates, maybe it's Diogenes, maybe it's other people. And then we have this, again, turning to discussion of art, an art concerned with the soul. And we see these discussions referencing Cicero, referencing Galen, and thereby Chrysippus, the important Stoic philosopher. And, some differences between this. And he brings up again, this is on page 70, different types of art or craft. And he looks at, whether the art of living is a productive or performative or stochastic art. And the Stoics kind of differed on these, right? We get some discussion of Seneca going on in the relationship between ascesis and logos. And then we get into the Stoic division of philosophy into physics, ethics, and logic. And here again, we see that the Stoics, they're not all on exactly the same page. They have different conceptions of how these are connected with each other. And, this is important to bring to mind because I think a lot of people get quite mixed up about this. Instead of reading Stoic texts, this is a bit of an aside, or reading really quality literature on Stoicism, they read lower quality literature on Stoicism that does mention these 3 divisions, but kind of bollockses things up. So, this is a really great chapter. Then, chapter 4 turns us to a different school, the skeptics. Why would John Sellars, if he's trying to develop the Stoic conception of the art of living, why would he go to the skeptics? Well, because the skeptics actually tell us quite a bit about the Stoics, because the skeptics are arguing against the Stoics, but the skeptics also have in mind a certain way of living. So he talks about the skeptical method. Sextus Empiricus has arguments against there being an art of living that certainly have to be addressed and thought through. And this is actually quite a long section, then we have philosophy and biography and skepticism. And we find out that the skeptics themselves are not an exception to this rule that in ancient philosophy, it is important to think about how one lives. The skeptics themselves are advocating a way of life. Then we get to part 2, right? This logos and ascesis part. And the first chapter in there is about philosophical exercises. So if you're somebody who's into, Foucault's History of Sexuality, where he talks about, these techniques of the self, or you're into Pierre Hadot, or, other people thinking along those lines, talking about spiritual exercises, well, Sellars is going to be talking about that as well. And this brings, back the importance of ascesis and how that's connected, the concept of a spiritual exercise, and he actually talks about Hadot there as well as other people. And then, we get to the function. What is the point of spiritual exercises? And he focuses rightly on habituation, but then there's an interesting section here on digestion. It's not a just stimulus response. We're supposed to learn through doing exercises how to, live a better life. And part of that is, you might say, building the muscles involved. Then he talks about the mechanism of spiritual exercises and the form of spiritual exercises. How do these work? And this is the one chapter without a summary. The next 2 chapters are ostensibly about 2 really, really key texts. And Sellars is using these as, kind of case studies. So the first one is on the handbook or the Enchiridion of Epictetus. And he, tells us about what the handbook is, and he brings in Simplicius's commentary. Simplicius, by the way, is not a Stoic. He is a Neoplatonist philosopher writing several centuries after Epictetus, but somebody who very helpfully tells us some things about this handbook. And here Sellars, brings in the 3 kinds of spiritual exercises, and he's tying this in with, the 3 topoi, the 3 subject matters that Epictetus certainly himself thinks are central in philosophy. Sometimes this is called the 3 disciplines, and they're talked about in different ways. So like they'll talk about the discipline of desire, which is actually the discipline of desire, and of aversion, and also of the emotions. The discipline of action, which is better understood as the discipline of choice, right, which has also to do with duties. And then the discipline of assent, which has to do with all sorts of epistemological matters, including assent, including impressions, including all these other key ideas that really fall into Stoic logic. And we're going to talk more about the 3 topoi, but this is how Sellars divides things up. And he thinks that the Enchiridion can be divided up along the lines of these 3 disciplines and along the lines of ethics, physics, and logic, which is an interesting interpretation, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And then, ends with a, thing about the philosophical bios and some philosophical maxims. So, he's providing an interesting reinterpretation of the Enchiridion here. And then he talks about this final chapter, exercises in the meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Now, in this chapter, he does talk about Aurelius. He talks a lot about Epictetus first because he's framing the meditations in terms of Epictetus's 3 disciplines. And, it's it's plausible. It makes sense to do that. He also hits on some of the things that are really key to Marcus, this cosmological view of things, the discussions of impressions and judgments, and there's a great section here in late in this chapter where he talks about these distinct stages in the analysis of impressions. There's a 4-stage thing that I think could be quite helpful. There's discussions of what are called adequate impressions, the cataleptike, and epistemological exercises in the meditations. And then we get to the conclusion. And so, this is kind of interesting. The first section of it is called Towards a Technical Conception of Philosophy. He doesn't mean philosophy is technical in the sense of like it's just a preserve for, those who are the cognoscenti, the knowers, right? Us academics or anything like that. Technical means techne. It's connected with an art that all of us can actually study and learn, whether we do so in the academy or not. So he's, revisiting that. He talks about 2 conceptions of philosophical knowledge and, the difference that some observe between episteme, knowledge, and wisdom, either phronesis and sophia. And this is the Stoics don't actually view these as different from each other. And then he reasserts the importance of philosophy and biography. And then he tells us there's essentially, in ancient philosophy, 3 different kinds of philosophical texts. There's literature that's concerned with arguments and doctrines, right? Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, a theoretical treatise, commentaries like Alexander of Aphrodisias. And then there's literature concerned with actions, the biographical literature, anecdotal material, histories of people. But there's also literature concerned with spiritual exercises, ascesis, right? Texts for guiding exercises such as Epictetus's Handbook, texts written as exercises like Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. And, it's a great way of looking at how Epictetus's ideas and Aurelius's ideas, as we get them in these works, are connected with each other. And then there's this discussion of the technical conception of philosophy. I read some of that to you earlier. And, this is this notion that philosophy is a techne. It is not just an episteme, a body of knowledge arranged in a treatise, something that we teach in classes. It's a way of living. And so these are some of the really key points about the work, and I hope I've given you an adequate summary of what you would find there. I'm always delighted to have a lot of positive things to say about a work. It's not always the case, but it is, in fact, the situation with this book, The Art of Living, the Stoics on the Nature and Function of Philosophy. I mentioned already the style of the work, and this is not unique to this particular book by John Sellars. He has a very enviable style, writing as an academic, but writing in such a way that the ordinary literate person who's interested in philosophy without a strong technical background in it can get a lot out of it. It's a really well-written book, and I think if you read it, it might require going over passages several times, but it's going to be because the material itself or the concepts are difficult, not because John Sellars has made it difficult for you. So that's an excellent thing to be able to say. I think that another really good point about this work, to begin with, the scholarship is just superb. It's heavily footnoted, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. There's all these great discussions. Everything is being referenced and explained. And, John is one of these people who has read, and not just read, but studied very, very widely. And not just in ancient philosophy. He understands ancient philosophy through, contemporary people today talking about it, but also the grand sweep of history as well. So that's really quite admirable. He's attentive to the differences, not just between philosophical schools like the Aristotelians versus the Platonists or the Stoics versus the skeptics, but also within a school itself, like the Stoics. So, where, for example, one Stoic thinks one thing and another thinks another thing, you can count on John to actually bring that to light and to say, okay, these are, differing conceptions here. Let's not just blur over these. Let's pay attention to what's happening there. Another thing that I think is really, really great about this book is following out these other distinctions, like, his discussion of the different kinds of arts. And so thinking very seriously about what is this art of living that we're calling philosophy, if we're looking at it in a Stoic perspective or we're looking at it in other perspectives as well. That's a really solid piece of not just scholarship, but also like deep thinking about these matters that is guided by the thinkers who he's engaging with. The meaning of ascesis. That's something that is being explored here as well. A lot of people like to use that word because it's a cool Greek term. What does it actually mean? It's not meaning exactly the same thing to Plato as it is to the Stoics. And, being able to explain that, I think, is quite good. Examining counterpositions, thinking about Aristotle's take on these things, or thinking about the skeptics, that entire chapter considering mostly Sextus Empiricus and his views, but, situating it within a paradigm provided by skeptical philosophy in antiquity, which took over Plato's Academy, by the way, and Sextus, is, responding later to both to Pyrrhonism and to academic skepticism. So that's a really great strength of the work, I think. I also find that, in chapter 7, rereading this, I actually, I'm pretty much convinced by John Sellars' reinterpretation of the meditations in light of the three disciplines. And I think it's a good interpretation. John Sellars isn't the only person, obviously, to bring this up. Pierre Hadot does as well. But I think what's in here is really, really quite a good interpretation. So it's plausible, but man, it also provides you with sort of like a model of what that kind of interpretation ought to look like. So that's pretty cool as well. So, a lot of very positive things to say about this book. It's the kind of book that, as I've said before with a few other reviews that I've done, as a researcher, as a writer, you read a book like this and you're like, oh, that is so good. I wish I was able to write a book like that myself. So there's a bit of not envy, but emulation involved as well in reading this. But I think for most other readers, they might have that reaction, but they're also going to be like, wow, this is really helpful for me. I only have two things that I'm going to call problematic here, and they're not like deeply problematic. They're things where there can be reasonable disagreement about these matters. So I may be at odds either with other readers or with John Sellars on these sorts of things. And the first one is about his interpretation of how the Enchiridion, or the Handbook of Epictetus, is structured in chapter 6. I think that Epictetus does have three topoi, right? I buy into that completely, that Epictetus is originating this. I don't see that as central to Stoic philosophy in general, and I also don't think that the three topoi line up neatly with the physical, the ethical, and the logical. So, when Sellars is saying that sections 2 through 29, the first of the three types of exercise in the handbook, is concerned with desires and aversions, and this can be seen to correspond to physics, I'm like, yeah, I don't know about that. That seems a little bit too neat. And here's one of the reasons why I find his interpretation here plausible, interesting, but problematic. Simplicius, who he brings up, who wrote a commentary on Epictetus's Enchiridion, he also says, well, Epictetus's Enchiridion is structured in these ways, and it, falls into these different sections, and it doesn't map onto what John Sellars is doing. So you gotta say, all right, there's multiple plausible constructions, organizations of Epictetus's Enchiridion. This one can't be just the, automatic, intuitive one. It's a plausible one, but, there's multiple plausible ones. So that's one thing to say, right? Now, the other thing to say, I don't see it as problematic, but I can see how some readers might view things as problematic. I'm going to show you a typical set of pages. All right, so you look at that right there. What are you seeing? Well, there's a lot of footnote, right? And almost every single page of the book has a lot of footnotes. If you don't like that, you're going to be bothered by that in this book, and you're going to be constantly going, oh, I'm missing something in the footnotes, right? If you like footnotes, which I do, I grew up as a reader reading books where they were extensively footnoted, and oftentimes there's really cool discussions in the footnotes. I look at them as sort of like, oh, these are like little side conversations. If you like that sort of thing, that's not problematic at all to you, and you're going to love it because... Again, just about every single page in the main body of the text has got some footnotes. There's a few pages that don't have footnotes, but they're the rarity. So those are the only things that I really find problematic about this book. Final thoughts. If you've made it this far in the review, I think you've figured out that I think this is a really great book, that if you have any interest in philosophy as an art of living, if you have an interest in Stoicism, if you have an interest in ancient philosophy in general, you want this book. This should be on your shelf. It should be part of your library. So, I highly recommend it, unqualifiedly recommend it. I would say get this. I also want to say thank you once again to Dominic Escorpeso for sending me this copy of the book. I know it's taken me a little bit longer to get around to a review as promised, but I have now delivered on that promise. So thanks to him. Thanks to John for writing this excellent book. And that's it. I highly recommend it.